Well, good evening, everybody. This is the last sermon in our series, Living Beyond Myself. And over the last few weeks, we have been exploring how it is that the gospel frees us from living these insular, self-centered lives and shows us how revealing God's goodness is marked by a life that's directed outward toward others. And so Rich has been leading us through overcoming the obstacles of emptiness, paralysis, doubt, burnout, temptation. And before I continue, I just want to ask, I was out last weekend, did he really bring you guys chocolate chip cookies here? I got nothing. I'm sorry. This morning we're going to talk about overcoming forgetfulness. And as we wrap up this series, I want to start us off by doing a little exercise in memory recall. Are you ready? Okay, so I want you to turn to your neighbor and I want you to tell them what were the three most important historical events that took place in your lifetime, these kind of world-shaping events. All right, ready? 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, I'm going to pull you back together. You probably only got to 2 of those things that took place in your life. That's the first question for life groups this week. You can finish talking about those, just give you a head start as you start thinking about it. But for me, one of those events took place on January 28th, 1986. I was in first grade when the Challenger took off. And I remember as clear as day the look on my teacher's face when the news of that tragedy struck her and reached news of our first grade classroom. Another one for me was November 9th, 1989, the day that the wall came tumbling down. I remember this one particularly because at the time we had a foreign exchange student from Berlin living in our house. And I remember my mom yelling down the hallway, "Carola, come here, you've got to see what's happening." And she said, "Yeah, right, like that's ever going to happen." And then when she saw people with hammers pounding away at the wall, just the tears that came streaming down her face. But there's one date on here that I remember, and I imagine everyone has it in common. You probably remember exactly where you were when you first saw images of American Airlines Flight 11 colliding into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Happened at 8:46 in the morning. And like a lot of us out here on the West Coast, I got up, I showered, I grabbed a cup of coffee, I was getting ready to go out to work, and I was completely oblivious as to what was taking place 3,000 miles away in the other part of the country. And just earlier that year, I had gone out to visit a friend of mine who lived in Manhattan, and I could see from her apartment in Greenwich Village those majestic towers cutting into the sky like steel sequoias in an urban forest, and the thoughts that the Manhattan skyline was now altered permanently. It just never entered my mind. It didn't seem real. When I arrived in my classroom that morning, ready to teach my first period AP Lit class, all of my students were gathered around a television in the common room. We didn't talk about Greek tragedy that morning because we were living our own. We all remember how we felt that morning. It's a day that's always going to mark time. Maybe the first time since Pearl Harbor that our nation caught a glimpse of its mortality, and it was terrifying, and it was incredibly confusing. But it's a day that's locked inside our memory. Somehow, even the most mundane of details got etched down a little bit more permanently on that day. Memory has a way of bringing us back to the important things. There are some things we never want to forget because they're part of the story of who we are. And they tell us what we value. After all, there's a reason that we celebrate anniversaries. It's because they allow us to remember that this daily life of hurts and chores, that's not what shapes a marriage, but it's the promises that we make on a particular day. And there's a reason we take a day to remember the men and women who believed that the dream of America was something worth dying for. It's something that we can't ever take for granted. And there's a reason that we gather together each week to remember who God is and to remember the cross and the empty tomb and remember that God is still at work in his people, bringing his kingdom and making earth look a little bit more like heaven. Well, if there was one day that stood out in the minds of the ancient citizens of Jerusalem, it would have taken place sometime in the year 587 BC. That was the year that the Babylonians broke through Jerusalem's city walls and laid waste to the temple and carried them off to captivity. And seeing the temple destroyed and in ruins, it utterly crushed the soul of the people. One biblical scholar puts it this way: everything that was visible and institutional, all that seemed theologically guaranteed by God's faithfulness, all that gave symbolic certitude and coherence, all that was linked to significance, identity, and security was gone. Just crumbled and burned in fire. It was just a few centuries earlier that God had promised his people the gifts of land and security and abundance. And the memory of those gifts and of the God who gave the gifts were kind of the glue that held their society together. But then as the years went on, and while Israel began to flourish during those feast years, the memory of the leaner days started to fade away. And they started to get into their heads that all that they had was the result of their own hard work. Prosperity causes amnesia, writes Walter Brueggemann. And people with amnesia forget who they are. And if you forget who you are, it's really easy to forget what you're supposed to do. And if you forget who you are and what you're supposed to do, it's not long before you start to wonder if anything has any meaning at all. I love the way that the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre puts it. He says, "I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question, of what story or stories do I find myself a part? Deprive children of stories and you leave them unscripted, anxious stutterers in their actions as in their words." Well, forgetting their story goes a long way toward explaining how the people of Israel forgot who they were and how they got carted off into Babylonia, where they had to endure a half century of exile. We're going to pick up that story in the book of Nehemiah in chapter 8. I'm going to read parts of it, and I want to invite you to grab and open up your pew Bibles and follow along. In the time of Nehemiah, there's this group of Israelites who are living in Jerusalem, and when Nehemiah gets there, he finds that the people are dejected and broken down, and it absolutely breaks his heart. And his tears turn into a prayer, and his prayer turns into this vision of God restoring the people by starting some urban renewal projects. And by chapter 8, they've already rebuilt the wall and they've brought the temple back, but even while there's a lot of good things going on, they're still in exile. They're still ruled by another nation, and they're deeply troubled. They're starting to ask these questions. Where is God? What's the story that we're in? What are we supposed to do? We pick this up in Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 1. All the people came together as one in the square before the water gate. And they told Ezra, the teacher of the law, to bring out the scroll containing the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. It's really quite an unusual scene. There's this religious gathering. All the people are kind of huddled together, and they come with this deep brokenness and this deep longing. Enough brokenness to set aside their old dreams, but enough longing to believe that maybe God is at work for them to dream some new ones. And as it turns out, hope is born at this place where brokenness and longing meet. God shows up in that place. God can use people who are in that place. So there's this gathering, and the strange thing is it's not the religious leaders who initiate it. Verse 2 tells us that someone tells Ezra the priest to go and get a scroll and start reading it. And Ezra's like, where do I start? And the people say, well, it doesn't matter. Just start reading it. How about you start in the beginning? Because we've got to know if our lives have any meaning. Because we don't know what to do if we don't know the story that we're a part of. And so the text continues. Ezra read it aloud from daybreak until noon as he faced the square before the water gate in the presence of the men, women, and others who could understand. And all the people listened attentively to the book of the law. And Ezra starts to read, and the people are hearing these stories of creation and the flood and of God's covenant with Abraham and his faithfulness to Joseph and the redemption story of the Exodus. And people are hearing this, get this, they're hearing this for 6 hours. He's reading scripture to them, and they're standing there with rapt attention for 6 hours. By the way, how am I doing on time? You guys want to keep going? I can do this all day. You got dinner plans. Okay, I get it. But they're there, they're gathered, and the obvious question to us is, what is going on? How could they just stay there and stand? And so Ezra brings out the scroll. And he praises the law and the God who gave the law. And the people bless him, and they bless the law, and they bless his reading of the law. And the story goes on to say that the people fall down on their faces and they weep. And so they're in this service all day long and Ezra starts distributing priests to go out and to tell them and to make sure that they understand what's being read. They're in the town square, and they're standing up, and they're praising God, and they're weeping, and they're listening to Ezra, and what is going on? It's kind of hard for us in this fast-paced kind of technological age to imagine doing anything for 6 hours straight. But imagine that you had been taken out of your home and from everything that you loved and held dear. And you're finally allowed to go back, but you didn't really know what to do once you got there. Nothing looked familiar. Your memories were a little bit jumbled and fuzzy. And the building was done, and you kind of forgot why it was important to begin with. And you're there, you're thinking, now what? It's not like they had the same distractions. There was no TV, no internet, no Instagram, no Candy Crush, no Snapchat, no Hulu, no Vine, no photo memes, no videos of cats jumping awkwardly off. Oh, I think he's going to make it every time. No text, no Twitter, no FaceTime, no Facebook, no book. The people have no books. Just a few dusty scrolls that your grandfather vaguely remembers. Imagine a bookless existence. Imagine that you're hearing this story read to you, and maybe for the first time. And you've come with all kinds of questions. Is there any point to this existence? Or are we here just functioning, not really living these lives that are nasty, brutish, and short? Are we just here where another nation is going to come in just as easily as the last one did and destroy everything we've rebuilt and move us out of here again? Is the best that we can hope for just to eke out an existence, wrapping up as much pleasure as we can and avoiding as much pain as possible? Is that all that there is? So you have these questions. And then you hear a story. And it's not just any story, it's the story that makes sense of your life. You hear the story about a God who created and ordered the world and how sin entered and how it holds you and everyone around you captive and brings ruin and explains why there's such brokenness, such oppression, and such pain. And then they hear the story of Abraham and about how through him God brings a blessing, and he blesses Abraham so that all of the nations can be blessed. And you think to yourself, wow, that's why I'm here. That's who we are. We're here to be a blessing to be a blessing to others, to all people. That's my purpose. That's my calling. And then you hear about how your people were in captivity once before. And this God who created you and who made a covenant with you, he goes to great lengths to free you, not to give you up and to bring you out of oppression. And he takes you through the wilderness and into this land that you're in, and he provides you with everything you need to live justly and deeply and well. And you start to fall in love with this story because it rings true. And because you start to see yourself in the plot. But then you begin to hold up that story to the plot of the one that you're actually living. This life that you're living that has actually forgotten all about God. This life which is anxious and afraid and self-centered, and which holds on with a tight and angry fist to any blessing that comes its way. And then it hits you. I haven't been living. I've just been existing. Life is meant to be free and good and full of abundance for everyone. But instead, I've just been looking out for myself. We've forgotten all about this God who made the world good, and we've put ourselves at the center of it. When you hear that story, what else would you be doing for 6 hours other than letting it wash over you? Because it's the only story that matters. And then in the middle of it, this memory of who they are and of who they belong to just comes flooding back. Now, maybe the strange scene isn't so strange after all. And then their leaders tell them in verse 10, okay, stop crying now. This is actually good news. God has done it before. He can do it again. Go out and have a feast and share it with everyone, rich and poor, because this God wants all of His people to experience abundance. We've rebuilt the wall and we've rebuilt the temple. And now God's going to rebuild you. We're going to continue gathering together to hear this story, to tell this story. And if we're going to live into this future that we believe that God has for us, we have to believe that our hearts can be renovated as well. Because this God, He takes up residence at the place where brokenness and longing meet. And He resurrects their memories, and He resurrects the people, and hope is born. Have you ever been in a place where brokenness and longing meet? This February, I was part of a small team from St. Andrews who got to travel to a rural village in El Salvador to work with our mission partner, Enlace. Enlace is the Spanish word for link. It's this reminder that the roots of poverty aren't just due to a breakdown in economics, but they're actually due to a breakdown in community, in relationships. And what Enlace does is it helps pastors. They, like Marvin here on the left, he helps pastors cultivate this redemptive passion for their community so that they can go into their church and with that same passion and help them to reach out to those who are within and who are outside of the walls. To go outside of their church to meet human needs. And this plays out in a number of economic and educational initiatives. And in Coluco, where our team was sent, respiratory illness plays a pretty big factor in determining quality of life. All of the meals are cooked on these indoor, traditional wood-fired stoves, and smoke is everywhere in the house. So Enlace comes alongside, and they help this community figure out which issues they wanted to solve. And then they came alongside Marvin to say, how can you help organize your people to reach into the community, to locate financial resources, and to provide the labor to create these eco-stoves that will funnel the smoke out of these homes and give people a better quality of life? The whole vision is about neighbors helping neighbors. And it was an amazing thing to see people who are in great need themselves set aside their own interests so that they could invest in others. And we came alongside not so much to help with the project, although we did get our hands dirty in there, but more than anything, we were there to offer encouragement and support when they were weary. And to witness for ourselves what exactly happens when people who are empowered to look beyond themselves do so, and they find great joy in giving to others. And we were there to find hope and brokenness in our own longing. Every week in this little tin-roofed church, Marvin reminds his people that they gather for worship and that the joy of the Lord is their strength. And that this joy is not going to be found by retreating away from the world into some spiritual community, but by actually digging in and rebuilding the community that you're a part of. To see the hopefulness and the joy at what God was doing. And the place where their longing for God can actually help repair the brokenness of their community. And as I was there for a week, suddenly I had my memory awakened. Because I got a glimpse that this is really who we are as God's people. We gather each week to be reminded that we are blessed to be a blessing to others. We gather each week to tell the story in here so that we can live the story out there. It's so easy to forget. But in the telling and in the living, we'll start to remember. If you look outside, you'll notice that there's a big hole in the middle of our campus. You have noticed that, right? Okay, good. And there's some walls that are starting to go up. We're in the process of building our own walls and renovating our temple. And we're doing that so that we can create a space to belong. So that those who maybe haven't heard can encounter the story that makes sense of their lives. We caught, I think, a brief glimpse of that this week when this overflow of heartbreak and pain from tragic loss brought all kinds of people onto our campus, into the youth center on Thursday night so that they could have a place, a sacred space, to process their heartache, their anger, confusion. And I think to hear subtle tones of that story that says, this is not how it's supposed to be. And this pain breaks God's heart. But it's not always going to be so. But in order for us to become the kind of people who can help others hear that story, we have got to get the story in us. We've got to hear that story in worship. We've got to remember that story in our baptism, and we've got to dig into that story in our life groups. The tractors and the bulldozers, they can make a space to belong out there. But God also wants to create a space for people to belong in here, in our own lives and in our own hearts. And He's going about this renovation process the way that He always does. By letting our hearts break at the distance between our own me-focused lives and the life that Jesus is calling us toward. God wants to do renovation in us. Because His people were never meant to stay huddled up inside walls. They were meant to be a blessing to others. The story that Nehemiah heard reminded them that they were a nation of priests, that they were to be a light to the nations. And we hear that story because we believe that Jesus came to break down the walls between people. And so we've got to let this work of renovation resurrect this memory that we were blessed to be a blessing. That the story that we hear in these walls each week is just too good to stay in these walls.